Well, since the recording is on, maybe what we can do is, may I, because this will be on the record for the session, may I ask the two speakers already to introduce themselves and give a bit summary before the real speech. Kaneko, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. It's an absolutely pleasure to join the EuroDIG session again. I was here at the venue. I was remotely participating in the EuroDIG session, and we kind of had initial discussions on today's topic on interplanetary internet. And I'm sure you're seeing some of my bios, but I currently serve as the chairperson of the Inter-Planetary Networking Special Interest Group. We are a nonprofit organization within the U.S. California state, and we also belong to the Internet Society as an interplanetary chapter. So I'm really excited to talk about our developments today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaneko. And Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Jim Shear. I work for NASA in the Space Communication and Navigation program at NASA headquarters. I'm the chief architect, and I'm currently working on developing LunaNet, which will become the lunar internet. It has distinct similarity to the terrestrial internet, but also distinct differences in that it's not only communication and networking capability, but also navigation, position, timing services. And it really functions as a command and control network for our planned missions to the lunar surface, the lunar orbit, missions in transit to and from the moon. And but like the internet, it will be open to all of the users on and around the moon. And so there are a lot of internet principles that we are carrying forward into the definition of LunaNet. And it's really become the first point of starting to implement the interplanetary network that we hope to one day extend across the solar system as we expand into the solar system.
Thank you, Jim. Just as a matter of disclosure, I am Roberto Gaetano. I'm in EuroDIG, which is the organization, the regional organization within ICANN that is a representative of the user community, the European user community. And I have followed a lot of the internet governance discussion since even before the creation of ICANN. And my main interest in this matter is to figure out whether we are facing a situation with the new protocols, with the bundled protocols, and with all the issues that are related to protocols for interplanetary communication, whether we need to not to do what we did with the original internet, that we developed a multi-stakeholder governance model only when, to a certain extent, the ox have left the barn already. So if I'm just figuring out whether we can develop a governance model ahead of time so that we have an orderly development. So it's already 5 minutes past the beginning. We have 3 people here in the room. We have several people online. Majority of the people are attending online. So if Kaneko, if you agree, maybe you can start your presentation and we can start.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me try full screen mode. Is it working?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started. Thank you so much, Roberto, and hello everyone from our friends from Europe, and thank you very much for this fantastic opportunity to speak about interplanetary internet governance. I was actually here at the EuroDIG session in 2022 to first introduce this topic, and we had this initial conversation. And since then, IPN-SIG has had a lot of discussions around this topic. So I'm here to talk about our progress and really excited to share our developments that we made so far. So I want to really start by addressing you with why we think governance is a theme today. So, you know, when we look around the globe, we're seeing many programs, including the government and space agencies and the private sectors that are endeavoring to extend communication capabilities off the planet. So it does seem that the construction of what we call the interplanetary internet is really starting to sail off. These are really, you know, absolutely remarkable steps for humankind, but it also poses the question of whether if we can end up in a common interplanetary network, like it was for the terrestrial internet. So we looked at this problem from both the technical side of how we can achieve a common network architecture and what are the governance required to support that architecture. So I want to start by just giving you a high-level context on space exploration today. I think some of you may have heard about the Artemis program that aims to bring humans back to the moon. I'm sure you'll hear more from Jim later on, but I think everyone would recall we had the Apollo mission more than 50 years ago, and during Apollo, each mission had a fairly short stay on the moon. But for Artemis, it envisions to set long-term human presence on the lunar surface to conduct exploration and science and technical demonstrations, and also many businesses are expected to emerge as well. And so in this context, NASA and ESA ESA is a European Space Agency. They are both looking at implementing the lunar internet, so-called the LunaNet, which is a set of cooperating networks providing interoperable communications and navigation services for users on and around the moon, which is capable of supporting exploration and science and also space businesses. So these things are coming very close. And this is just really showing the significant amount of interest from all over the world, from the private sectors and academia, who are getting really interested in joining the space communication arena. These are just examples of some of the companies and universities, but you can see the amount of interest is really building up from all over the world. And you know, if we're successful, we might have an interplanetary network backbone, like you see in this picture, that connects the moon and Mars assets, connecting to our Earth systems, and kind of serving as a single backbone for multiple purposes. And speaking a little bit about IPN-SIG, so the IPN-SIG really envisions that we should make IPN as a common structure, because in the end, it all becomes a benefit for humanity, right? And the key enabler to make that happen is to work toward a coherent architecture and to form a collaborative governance mechanism. So we've been seeing that several space agencies are bringing in their LunaNet assets to space, and so are the private companies has intentions. So the question is, could we achieve a common interplanetary internet in the end, is our theme today. So I really like to show this picture because this is kind of very analogical to me in what's actually happening, what's about to happen in space, and what had occurred in the history of the internet. So the one on the left is a schematic of where ARPANET and SATNet and PRNet, they started to interconnect with each other using TCP/IP. And I see it as in the not too distant future, we will also see interconnections of different networks in space as well. So when I look back on the history of the internet, it seems to me that we're going to see something very similar in space, which is the interconnection of networks. And then the networks of networks made up to the internet today as we know it today. And when we reflect upon ourselves, I believe there were several key aspects that made the internet such a successful infrastructure. One to me is the technology part. We had TCP/IP, and that provided us with a single way of doing things. And we also have the open standardization mechanisms as we operate today at the IETF, and that we also had a governance model, so-called the multi-stakeholder model, allowing everyone to have a say to the internet. So to me, these are the key components that led to the internet today. And the interplanetary internet would have a promising path, in my opinion, if we had learned from the success of the internet. We should also have a technical way of communicating at interplanetary distances. In our case, would be the DTN technology, and the open standardization efforts should also be continued. And last but not least, having a collaborative governance mechanism would be the key to establish a sustainable communication infrastructure, well, even in space. So in 2022, the IP&SIG formed the Architecture and Governance Working Group to study the technical and management aspects in order to achieve such an interplanetary network backbone. This was really an amazing team formed by Vint Cerf, as you know it, and many engineers from the space agencies and also from the private sector. We also invited Dr. Laura DeNardis, who's an expert in internet governance, and Dr. Scott Pace, who's an expert in space policy as well. So at the working group, we kind of started by framing what the issue is. Since the interplanetary network could be made up of multiple and interconnected networks that requires collaboration to function. So from an architectural perspective, how could the various networks, whether it could be a space agency's one or a private sector's one or an academic network, so how could they work as a whole was the crux of the question. And then the governance part was that what institutions would play what role to support the operation of the interplanetary network, or what do we need to govern anyway, and what governance model should we employ for its operation. So these were kind of the starting point questions that we have asked upon ourselves within the working group. And the term governance could be a quite tricky term, but we have defined it for the purpose of our study as the way it's described in the top of this part, the administration and management mechanisms, it's supporting institutions in their practices toward an open, accessible, and common interplanetary network that's built and operated and used by the various entities. So that was the definition we made. So we looked at this problem from the four major perspectives that you see here, which are the policy-making processes and the open standard development and critical resource management and law and treaty. Here's an interesting story that came up while we had these discussions. We said that a moon internet could be a presumably realistic scenario. What I mean by this is to deploy internet protocol to the moon. If you were to put something on the moon, one might think that the use of IP would be a practical approach because of its technical maturity and its affordability. So moon internet could be a conceivable scenario, is what we have discussed at the working group. But we quickly discovered that there are many implications to this, whether would it interconnect with the Earth internet, or what IP address spaces should we be using for the moon, and who allocates those addresses, and so on and so on. So, but this thinking process had really forced us to think that we should be mindful of governance practices of IP use on other planetary bodies. So looking into these future scenarios, we've identified the top list of items that would require management for the operation of the IPN. Critical resources, of course, such as spectrums and node numbers and IP addresses. These things has limitations in its capacity. So there's a need of some management mechanism for allocation purposes. And we should also have a universal standard which defines the basis of the infrastructure. Those would include time in space, or coordinate systems. Those are the physical coordinates, and many technical protocol standards, including routing and bundled protocol and so on. So at a high level, we thought these are the top list that requires some form of governance for the interplanetary network. So then our next question was, who and how should they be managed? And we did contemplate on that. And so starting with the right-hand side, so for spectrum, ITU allocates frequencies today to certain services, and each state would do the authorization for that use. And we think this mechanism could be well extended to frequencies in space as well, specifically beyond the GSOs, the geostationary orbit that includes the moon as well. So as far as spectrum, we think that leveraging the existing management mechanisms we have at the ITU would work for IPN as well. And for IP addresses and ASNs, we said that the existing IANA function and the registry, regional registry structure could serve as the body to allocate these resources for space uses as well. There were some discussions during the working group on setting up a standalone space registry per se, but we concluded that those decisions could be made in the longer term as we find the need of it as we move along. And for BP node numbers, the IETF is already recommending IANA to serve as the master depot. And under that will be the allocators who would allocate BP numbers. So we think we should pursue those decisions. And for standardization, there's the IETF and CCSDS, which is the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, serving as a technical standardization body. And we think these efforts should be well continued. And for time and coordinates systems, we don't really have a universal standard yet at this very moment. So we should be paying attention on what standards will be adopted and how they will be managed. We've also looked at how space law and treaty could effectuate interplanetary internet governance. So today, basically space activities are all considered to be a nation state activity. That's per the Outer Space Treaty, which was adopted a long time ago by the UN General Assembly in 1967. And in that treaty, it says that the states owe responsibility to assure the behavior provided in the Outer Space Treaty for any given mission of that country, even if it's a private sector's activity. So the treaty was adopted more than 50 years ago and hasn't changed ever since. So it really doesn't take into account the proliferation of commercial activities in space. And per our observations, we think that there's no fundamental barriers from a law and treaty perspective at this moment, but one might expect some potential clashes could occur between public and private interest as more commercial activities expand into space. So we just talked about space activity being a nation state activity. So it's based on a sovereignty model as opposed to the internet taking the multi-stakeholder approach where everyone has a say. So they both have very different governance models. And here's an interesting equation. So space times internet is interplanetary internet, but space governance is based on sovereignty today, and internet governance is multi-stakeholder. So what's the governance model for the interplanetary network was something that we have contemplated on. And this is showing our preliminary assessment out from the working group. We talked about this several times, and what we have drawn together was that first and foremost, we think that the multi-stakeholder governance model is the most sustainable approach for policy-making processes, as the internet has proven to us today. The second point is that the internet did not dictate anything around configuration or business models. It allowed autonomy, which allowed the autonomous growth of networks. And we think that this concept should also be advocated for in the IPN as well. And the third point is the open standards is really important because that's really the driver for supporting the autonomous growth of the network. And we should also have a venue to discuss any IPN issues that may arise over the course of its operation. And I think IGF and governance forums like EuroDIG would be a perfect venue to have these policy discussions for IPN as well. And as far as allocation of critical resources, governance at the right levels is probably the way to go based upon the lessons from the internet, which basically means no centric management and pursue a kind of a distributed management mechanism. And we should also be mindful that there's a uniqueness in space where we need to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. We did not have something like this in the internet, but as long as we do something in space, this is what we need to comply to. One might imagine that there could be tensions of the space sovereignty model and the multi-stakeholder model, which are two disparate concepts. And the tensions between the two could become a challenge at some point, is our observation. And last but not least, we should be mindful of some of the bad things that happens in the internet today could potentially infuse in space as well. For now, there's no immediate concern as to internet governance issues propagating into space, but as time progresses, those problems may occur as the users of the interplanetary network evolves. There could be a need for some mechanism to address those problems, and we need to be aware of that as well. So that was a very quick summary of our work over the years on IPN governance, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kaneko. I would like to have to check if from the audience or either online or here in the room there are any questions. We can allow a couple of questions, and then after I will give the floor to Jim for the next presentation. So any questions? Keith.
So how do you see the interplay between, how do you see bringing together both governments and commercial entities into this multi-stakeholder process? I mean, how do we cause all of these things to sort of work together toward a common goal?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think these things are not forced to be made. These things naturally happen. And I think these discussions that we have at EuroDIG and IGF, those really build up this momentum toward the multi-stakeholder model. So there's no top-down approach that we need to do multi-stakeholder. It's a natural evolution, I would say.
Samo, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. What I'm wondering, have you managed to identify what are the main risks behind this, so that we, what are the main risks that could prevent us to get a common IPN that would interoperate?
Well, first and foremost, I think, when we look at the internet, we have a common infrastructure, and we know that it's a really powerful tool, right? We use it every day. It's not just for texting. We use it for science discovery, for social and economic activities. It's lying under everything. So as people, goes off the planet and expand its sphere, I think the communication architecture or its infrastructure is really the basis that supports everything, science and exploration and even economic activities, because people are starting to do business on the moon and around the moon. So I think that's the main reason of trying to achieve the common infrastructure concept, because we want to see something very similar to the internet that conveys into space. And I think that's our vision at the IPNSIG, Samo.
Yes.
Okay, if there are any more questions, maybe we can have them at the end. I would like to give the floor now to Jim for your presentation, if you could stay within 20 minutes like Kaneko. Just for the record, we have 5 people here physically present in the room. Jim, the floor is yours.
Make sure I'm unmuted. All right, thank you, Roberto. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to report on is tangential to what Kaneko talked about with the IPN-SIG, and I'll mention how we are now starting to coordinate our activities. But what I'm talking about is dealing directly with the various national space agencies that are now in the process of developing space systems intended to head to the moon, some of which are already there, most of which are in the process of being developed and will be arriving in the next 10, 15 years. We have a group, an informal group called the Interagency Operations Advisory Group, or IOAG, that provides the kind of coordination between the civil space agencies that enables us to have this kind of conversation while we're formulating our independent national agency plans. And recently the IOAG, in working on developing LunaNet and LunaNet technical architecture and capabilities, realized that inevitably we were going to have to deal with governance questions as well. So we have just recently formed a committee to study LunaNet governance, and I'm here to tell you the status of our development with that right now. So to introduce this, first I have to say something about what is LunaNet, and then what is the IOAG. We are envisioning the technical architecture of LunaNet to be a set of cooperating networks, so a network of networks in a fashion similar to the terrestrial internet. This will also be similar to the internet in that it provides a set of services for communications and networking on and around the moon, but it does more than that. Here we're envisioning in the lunar environment that we're also incorporating navigation, or what we call PNT, position, navigation, and timing related services. So in the terrestrial environment, we see the American GPS, the European Galileo, Chinese Beidou, etc., as a variety of different global navigation satellite systems that are independent from the internet. In the lunar region, we're envisioning the navigation satellite architecture being part of LunaNet. So in that sense, LunaNet is broader architecture than the terrestrial internet. But like the terrestrial internet, it's based on a set of standards and agreed upon spectrum architecture, which is controlled by the ITU, and a set of service requirements that will be rapidly evolving as we are doing initial test flights, and then starting to begin building up capabilities aggregating on the moon with an Artemis base camp that NASA has planned, an international gateway, a small space station in lunar orbit, as well as a variety of separate landers that will land in various locations all around the moon, including the far side, and all of which will need these services to support them. Historically, we would have done this by a number of missions with simple point-to-point radio links. This does not scale up well at all, either from a spectrum standpoint or in terms of the amount of communication required. And so we're looking for a much more scalable architecture, and that's one of the key things that an internet-like architecture or LunaNet offers. Along with that, we expect to have many operators. So unlike the terrestrial internet, where your many operators offer the same kinds of services and they collectively add an enormous amount of capacity, but they are also competing against each other. In the lunar environment, what we project is that none of the space agencies, including NASA, has sufficient resources to put up all of the capacity, all of the coverage, all of the capability that we collectively need. So we are envisioning LunaNet as being less competitive and more cooperative, in that the capabilities of the various networks are viewed as additive. So if I need a large set of navigation satellites, and NASA provides some, and ESA provides some, and JAXA provides some, and commercial operators provide some, then collectively we can put up enough navigation assets to realize the kind of navigation accuracy that we need for position and orbit determination on and around the moon. So that requires a degree of coordination and cooperation, including on a daily basis in terms of operations, unlike what we see in the terrestrial internet. So these are things that are going to affect the architecture, but also the governance. So we see LunaNet as being not only a parallel to internet, but very much a second generation with additional and different capabilities that will require a different approach to governance. But we want to learn from the governance that we've spent 50 years acquiring on the internet to figure out how to govern LunaNet intelligently from the beginning. So with that as the background on LunaNet, then the IOAG is a basis that was started in 1999 by a set of space agencies. You can see in the lower left, the member agencies have their logos there: Italy, Canada, France, Germany, Europe, Japan, the USA, and the UK are the current 8 member agencies of the IOAG. And in addition to those full member agencies, then there are a number of observing agencies, including Australia, China, South Korea, Russia, South Africa, and United Arab Emirates that don't have either the resources to share communication and networking capabilities for cross support between the various agencies, or they just aren't, or they have some capability, but they just aren't participating in cross support. So what I mean by cross support is literally the ability for NASA to use our near space network or our deep space network to support a European or a Japanese or some other agency's mission, or in turn for NASA to use the support of ESA's or Japan's or some other agencies' assets to support. So this increases the routing complexity, but also the flexibility and operational resilience using a network of network approaches. Right now limited to national space agencies on a cooperative basis, but we expect this to be extended to a more commercial, mixed government and commercial approach in the near future. In particular, NASA and ESA right this minute have procurement activities that are underway to procure commercial lunar communication and navigation services. So we're just at the cusp of starting to enter into the joint government and commercial environment for the moon. So with that, we formed the committee to study LunaNet governance. The definition that we've adopted for LunaNet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and organizations that shape the evolution and use of LunaNet in the context of the relevant international legal framework. And my reference there is that this is actually based on the definition of internet governance that was adopted by the UN at the World Summit in 2005. This is an extension and modification of that definition. We're also collaborating with a number of related organizations that you see the icons on the bottom right. So the SFCG is the Space Frequency Coordination Group. That is our path into for the civil space agencies to coordinate spectrum needs that is fed into the ITU and the whole global process for establishing radio regulations. Conoco already mentioned CCSDS as the principal organization for developing space data standards. The ICG is a UN committee on global navigation satellite systems that fosters interoperability. Naturally, we're collaborating with the IETF and with IPN-SIG. So our relationship with Conoco and IPN-SIG is recent, and we've what you're hearing from the two of us is two independently derived stories right now, and we're now starting to get together and combine our thinking in order to address some of the problems that Conoco outlined. So our definition covers who is involved, what is involved, what we're trying to develop, when we're trying to do this over the course of developing and evolving LunaNet, and where in a legal context we need to do this. And we have to pay attention to both international treaty as well as the various national legal regimes around the world, which makes it very complex. So our vision then is to establish LunaNet as the open, interoperable, multinational, but more than national, multinational, commercial, academic, right? It's a multi-stakeholder type of approach is inherent in doing this. And so we've established the committee to go do the initial research on how the national space agencies will initially develop and start operating this, which will include transition to a broader multi-stakeholder relationship that will include industry and academia. So we're starting to study the alternatives and develop governance guidelines, which we can characterize as either technical guidelines or architectural guidelines, as well as operational procedural governance guidelines, and along the lines of what Conoco was discussing. The committee has established 4 objectives. The first one is specifically the primary objective to define and recommend a governance structure and approach for LunaNet that takes advantage of lessons learned from the internet and other international or multinational organizations that have established governance processes. That's part of our research. And then to secondly, recommend organizations that should participate, which can include some existing organizations, but may also recommend that some new organizations be developed to work in this new context. Objective 3, we want to specifically describe the differences. We're comparing LunaNet to Internet, but we're also comparing terrestrial GNSS and governance mechanisms there to LunaNet's navigation services and how governance should be established there. And then step 4 is to recommend how to set it up and put it into operation. So we have several phases defined to address this. Phase 1 is the research into predecessors and what's the state of affairs today. That's underway. Phase 2 then is to think about LunaNet. What's unique about LunaNet? How is it different from the predecessors? What governance do we need to establish? And to some extent, in what order? What do we need first and what can we put off till a little bit later? Phase 3 will assess then how to pull those various threads together into a variety of options for us to examine. Phase 4, which hasn't started yet, will be to define specific options, to discuss pros and cons, quantitatively analyze where we're able to use quantitative methods, and develop a scoring approach to figure out how we discriminate among the various options that will be available to us. Phase 5 then will be to down select to a recommended set of options, and then phase 6 in parallel with all of this is to provide documentation and continued outreach to the broader community, EuroDIG, Interop, the IGF, various forums for discussing governance, as well as the technical organizations and conferences that are related to this. So to wrap up my brief talk here, we've succeeded in defining terms of reference and negotiated with the stakeholders. We've recently signed that, so the committee is now formally underway. We have initial membership identified and team meetings have started. We've started work on phases 1 to 3. We're in the process of expanding the membership here. So as I talk to you right now, I'm sitting in London preparing for a week of meetings here at the British Standards Institute, where the IOAG is meeting with all of the various member agencies to discuss the road ahead on a variety of IOAG initiatives, part of which is LunaNet and LunaNet governance. So it's going on this week in London in parallel with EuroDIG. So we're very interested in feedback from the broader community, and we want to make this a two-way street in terms of communicating to the community and receiving feedback from the community. So we'll work with you as we move on, and we'll be doing a lot of coordination with Conoco and IPNC. With that, I'll stop and see if there's any time for questions.
Thank you, Jim. We already have one question from the floor, and I really invite more questions. I have first Jorge, and then a person in the audience. Jorge.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim. Interesting presentation. I only have, one question and concern is who and how you manage to have other stakeholders participate in this committee, particularly, civil society and private enterprises, and how you expect them to participate. I feel that we are making the same mistake, that we have in the early days of the internet, where, everything was US-centric, and finally we were able to have a multi-stakeholder model when ICANN was created, and everybody participated in the creation of ICANN. This is, something that looks like it's a very small group that is deciding for all the stakeholders. I would like, to hear your comment about that.
So the short answer to your question is we don't know the answer to your question. Start with admitting the truth up front. It is a small set of stakeholders right now. It has a lot to do with which organizations are establishing national objectives to go to the moon, to establish lunar capabilities. And unlike the Apollo approach 50 years ago, where it was an entirely US effort in competition in the Cold War with a Soviet effort that didn't succeed, but had it succeeded, we would have been in a very different position with competition between two global superpowers. Now I think we have the opportunity to establish a much more multilateral and much more cooperative and open environment on and around the moon, where humankind moves into the solar system in a broader sense. But it's still going to be influenced by money, by resources, and who's putting significant resources into this. The activities that we're undertaking require billions of dollars a year in the U.S. Federal budget, and similar resources, large resources on the part of other governments. But particularly in the case of the U.S. and ESA, one of the huge differences from the Apollo era is this time we are pushing to establish a lunar ecosystem, a lunar marketplace, and to establish upfront a commercial industry on and around the moon, on the Earth, providing services to the moon. And so, NASA and ESA are going to award contracts this year, if we're on schedule, to start creating a commercial communication and market on and around the moon that today does not exist, right? So you've got government-based backing. Think of it as angel investors trying to jumpstart a commercial market that doesn't exist. So are we starting from a small bunch of players dominated by some major governments? Yes. Are we planning to follow the same course that we cut for the last 50 years? No, we're trying to take a very different course and expand directly into commercial market and establish a broader marketplace for the benefit of industry, for the benefit of economy, for the benefit of international cooperation and growth. And so we are intent on trying to learn those lessons and do it a much better way this time. But clearly there's room for a lot of advice on how to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Before giving the floor to more questions, I wonder whether Kaneko has something to add to this very question.
Yeah, just one point of drawing more people into this governance discussion. This governance discussion just started just last year, and me and Jim is struggling to bring in more people to get interested in this topic. And that's why we're here for the EuroDIG, right? And we're trying to bring this attention to the main venue of the Internet Governance Forum so that many people will be aware of this issue and that start discussing this from the early phase of the interplanetary network deployment. So I just wanted to add that point that we're trying to grow and we're kind of exercising in order to bring many more people into this discussion.
Thank you, Kaneko. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm affiliated to a user community, and I believe that we are very much interested in getting into the picture. I think that the question is how we can think of something that we can present to the user community to justify their commitment and participation. I mean, users have a lot of things to think about, and as a difference with commercial users, the individual users have a job in a completely different environment. And so we need to motivate their participation to have a qualified participation. That we have seen also with the experience of the standard internet. I have a question from the audience here.
Apologies for the interruption, but we are now running out of time. So we will have to wrap this up since we have to prepare for the next session.
My clock is 11:22. We have 8 minutes, and I plan to close on time. Thank you.
The session is 45 minutes. It should end around 15
No, I have been told.
The next session will begin at half, so.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Quick questions, very quick questions, and then we'll follow up maybe online with the answers. Can you say that in few words?
Yes. My name is Jacques Reglinger. I'm from co-secretary of the Swiss IGF. I have a technical question that can be answered shortly, and I have something that has already almost been answered before. Technical question. We are talking, if I'm looking at lunar net, is it something totally different from planetary internet, or is it more or less the same, starting small and getting large? The other question I have is, when is the time when the broad public should discuss at the night at, let's say, my national Swiss IGF about the lunar internet? Is it something in 5 years' time, or starting right now? Because we have other topics to discuss right now. Great.
Thank you. There's one question in the chat. I think that we can follow up then on the email list. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. I thought we had the full hour. Okay, that brings the session to the end, and thank all for participating, and Alexi and Yata who were monitoring the session, and this session is now closed. Thank you.